Good afternoon. Thank you all for staying back. It's quite late in the day. This is going to be a brief half-an-hour session where we want to sort of take stock, the way I'm going to imagine this. We will take stock of epidemiology and its contribution to COVID-19, understanding COVID-19. So at a very high level, we'll see where the world is in this understanding. So Madhav, if it's okay with you, we'll start off with you. Tell us what is settled science, where there is no dispute about what epidemiology can do.
Good question. I think what is settled is that almost everything remains unsettled.
Yeah.
I think that's probably a fair way to say it. But having said that, and I am doing this real-time thinking, in terms of general, maybe I should talk about progress that we have made in science.
Sure.
That we have.
And progress that no one disputes, meaning there is no more like.
That's right. So there is no dispute right now in terms of the evolution of this disease through the variants. There is no dispute. There clearly is still a dispute in terms of the origins, so I will not count it as a undisputed fact, although more and more evidence is coming through, but that's something that we can stay open. There is no dispute that early interventions by the governments were helpful in slowing down the pandemic. There is still a dispute in terms of what its secondary and tertiary impact was on economic and social life. But there is no dispute that it certainly stalled the disease. There is no dispute that vaccines have been immensely helpful. There is dispute as to the level of efficacy and which vaccines have been good and which vaccines have not been good. But there is no dispute that vaccines have been effective. There is no dispute that surveillance of this is needed. We have heard two talks in the afternoon session. We are still open and trying to understand how the surveillance should be done. What I'm saying is there is a issue about social implications of this, where people are targeted, saying that some community might be affected and that might impact how the community is treated. Now that is not an issue in COVID, but if you all remember early on, people were very concerned that if you saw this virus coming into community, they were almost ostracized, right? Because they had felt it. So this part is not clear to me. There is no dispute to me that modeling has been useful, although I would argue that that's a biased opinion. How the modeling has been used is an open question. There is no dispute in my mind that phylodynamics and the work Chitra talked about, Mami talked about, is absolutely central, and going forward we'll have to do more of understanding the viral evolution with epidemiology. And finally, there is no dispute in my mind that this problem is as much a social problem as it is a biological problem.
Wonderful.
And what it means to me is that if we do not learn to cooperate amongst various groups, and this is a hierarchical issue, at the level of communities, at the level of a state boundary, at the level of a country and across country, then it's not very clear how we would address it next time. And the last part, there is no dispute that the logistics, there are secondary effects of the pandemic in supply chain logistics. And it creates, what is not clear is how would you solve it. If we all become more inward looking, then it's a problem. But there's no dispute that it caused problems. But I think that the ways to solve it should not be that everybody should move everything back into their country, because the connectivity has other advantages. So I'll stop there.
Wonderful. So Gautam, Madhav talked of the use of mathematical models. What is settled science now in terms of where mathematical models have helped us understand the progression of COVID and where there is still some work to be done? You've been involved in that aspect of COVID in India for some time.
Let me just get to that question by adding one more point to what Madhav's masterful summary of everything that we know and we don't know. What we do know is that data is important. What we also know is that we're not seeing enough of it in a transparent manner.
Okay.
And that I think is important, and particularly in the case of India, other types of LMICs, etc. We're not collecting the sort of data that is relevant to understanding what might happen in the future. Even if you remove models altogether, we still need data to be able to think about public health. Your question about models as such, I think models have got better. In a sense, some of them still refer back to the classic model that we know from 100 years ago, the classical compartment model, which is the first port of refuge for anyone beginning to study this. Then if you go a little later, we begin to incorporate all our knowledge of networks, small world networks, the real physical networks and social networks by which people interact. And then, of course, the last step would be something that is completely granular at the level of the individual, which is the agent-based model, which is a sort of somewhat more modern way of thinking about it. It's really late 90s, etc., etc. Although there are some precursors of this in the physics literature and computer science literature from before that. Models have now improved in the sense that they contain everything that we know about epidemiology, the etiology, the way the disease originates, how it transfers from person to person, etc. But where we fail is again something that Madhav alluded to, which is on the social side. How do you incorporate social behavior modification as a result of information that comes into the agents? This we still don't know. And that I think is probably the next frontier in terms of modeling. We can model individuals, we can say if you and I come close to each other within this is about a meter, so there's some probability that you will transfer the disease to me. Within me, I know what the rate at which the viral load increases and then comes down. I know the probability distribution that govern that. I know these are fairly broad. All of this we know from a number of clinical and biological studies. So much of the underlying science that should go into those models is really fairly clear. The difficulties come because these are broad probability distributions. They're not nice and sharp and peaked and Gaussian. Yeah. And so at the technical level, implementing it computationally is more straightforward than implementing it at the level of a theory or implementing the level of a mathematical approach. But we know that. What we don't know is how people's behavior changes.
Yeah.
So as far I see that as really being the next frontier of complex systems approaches and where really social science interacts with the sciences of epidemiology, behavior, computer simulations of disease transmission, etc.
Sure. Shubha, I want to first introduce Shubha. Shubha is an acclaimed science and tech writer in India, several decades of experience, she used to write for the Hindu quite regularly. Now she writes for IIT Madras Saastra, which is a science and tech magazine that we publish. We're fortunate to have you, Shubha. Thank you. I have a question for you that, from your vantage point, you've seen the disease progress both on the people scale as well as from the science side of things. One of the disputed points in COVID is the number of deaths. There's, I've seen a factor of 2 and 3, numbers that were factors of 2 and 3 apart in even developed countries, not just in countries like India. What makes it difficult to assess the number of deaths due to COVID? If you can talk to that a little bit, and also talk to the science behind, from your vantage point, the mix of social aspect with the science of how COVID progressed.
Okay, let me take the second part first. I think that communication is a very important part of controlling the pandemic and even managing it and so on. But that is, it is not always possible to do it because of the lack of awareness among people and the lack of cooperation that you get from, maybe heads of states who believe that there's a stigma in revealing, the data correctly and so on. So I think that maybe to add to, this is just, I don't know whether this is possible, but in modeling even, is it possible to add these factors? How well it is communicated to people so that there is awareness and acceptance of the importance of vaccines, for instance. The acceptance of, people who are risk averse may worry about adverse events. Is there a good communication of these things to the public? Whether these things matter in modeling, whether these are taken care of, maybe they are in an intangible way, but I don't know whether they are actually taken care of. And secondly, I think we have seen that in states where people were denying the fact that there were deaths and so on, there have been huge number of excess deaths, in not just in India, in overseas also. So there has to be some way of promoting awareness among the heads of states. And it's a very, very sensitive and very touchy subject, but that's something that we need to address somehow, especially policymakers who are present here and all that can actually take up this as something.
Is it difficult to ascertain the cause of cause of death being due to COVID? In other words, a death is counted as a COVID death only when there was a test prior to the death that confirmed the presence of the virus in the person. So, in the absence of such evidence, all corporations across the world, cities across the world, have counted that as an ambiguous death and not attributed the death to COVID.
Yes.
Is that in itself the right approach, or would you now, having gone through this with 2020 hindsight, propose an alternate approach?
Well, frankly, I don't know how to answer that very much in detail, but I certainly think looking at people like Ramanan's study of Chennai and so on, Tamil Nadu, in some areas the death certificates have been a good source of information and data, but it's not always true. There have been people who were thrown into the Ganges and things like that. So it's a very, very difficult question.
Sure.
Get the right perspective on this.
Sure.
But maybe
Madhav.
Gautam and...
Yeah, I just want to add something to the previous question, because I think, Mahesh, you have hit the nail here. The role of politics and social sciences is central to this problem. Myself, Simon Levin and Rita Colwell, we have written a white paper, and we have coined this term, which I think some of you might agree with, and we're calling it socio-political epidemiology. It's really about understanding the sociology and the politics that deeply affect this. And this pandemic has made it amply clear. It is not the case that this was not happening before, but I think this pandemic has laid bare this issue in a big way. And she has made a really important point of communicating this well.
Yeah.
But one of the problems, to sort of take a side where things have, look at it from standpoint of, say, political leaders, their view is that they have to manage the situation. And people have posed questions to me, which I would like to pose here, which I'm sure, would it be a good idea to report all the deaths when they were happening? Or perhaps that would have caused more panic and it was better. My view is transparency in the end is always better, because you gain trust from it. But I am not the person who manages large crowds, so I have to yield to those people's expert judgment. But incentives that we can create within a country and across country to be transparent and share information early and not to blame them would be the first step in trying to improve. Because eventually we cannot blame that this started at one country, or these countries are spreading it, or this community started it, this community is spreading it. I think in the end, that's not the way we should solve this problem at all. So trust has to come, and trust will come through transparency and acceptance of this in a meaningful way. So sorry if I took that.
No.
But I wanted to make
Gautam, I have a question for you. You talked of the hierarchy of models from the old elementary SIR to now more sophisticated agent-based models. There are, in every one of those models, there are a bunch of parameters that, you could say, let R equal to 2.2 and move forward, or some rho equal to 1, right? But if you want to ground that model for a politician, let's say, or a policymaker to really start using, you need to have a set of parameters that make sense. Is that still an area where, the extraction of parameters that make sense in the view of, in light of the fact that those parameters may themselves evolve over time? What does the science say around that?
So I don't think the politician is particularly worried about what numbers you're using.
But the predictions need to be...
So the difficulty there is, how do you communicate uncertainty? And this is something that everybody who works in this struggles with. How do you communicate uncertainty to the common person, to the politician, to the legislator, to the IAS officer, etc.? The fact that these are not, when you say that we expect this to peak at this point, it will be 2 weeks from now roughly, that these are not and can never be exact statements, because much can happen in between. At most, with since the system is relatively inertial, you can say 2 to 3 days in advance, you have a rough idea based on past and where things are going to go. But by the time you get to 2 weeks or 3 weeks or a month, all bets are off because any number of things could happen between now and then. But this is hard to convey because people want nice, clean answers. And you.
But even before you go near policymakers, we need to be sure we have parameters that we are happy with. Are we there?
So the current approach is not to treat them as point values, but to draw them from a distribution and ask how that distribution behaves. So these are Bayesian approaches, which incorporate some level of uncertainty that you have about what these parameters are.
Okay.
And that, in a sense, is a more natural way of thinking about it, rather than waiting for sort of single point predictions for what these numbers should be. And that gives you corresponding error bars of whatever you might predict. But the challenge here is explaining it. Can I just make one statement about what both of them said? And that's a sort of surprising point that I noticed, which is the importance of having a free press. I mean, all of this stuff about excess deaths, etc., came out. All the fact that cases were going up in Maharashtra after the 15th of February was something that was broken by a local journalist, Banagarwala. And this is something that it took, maybe a week to 10 days for the state government to acknowledge, a little longer for the central government to acknowledge. But had we paid more attention to that increase, which was basically happening in rural Maharashtra, we would have figured out that something was going on. We would have targeted sequencing to that region and known earlier on that some new variant was involved. And then modeling could have proceeded on that basis. But basically the modelers had nothing to work with. So the fact that you couldn't predict that was basically the fact that there was no information to work with at all. Just some scattered reports which were denied by the government at that point and only confirmed somewhat later. So even that and the discovery of the fact that there was a large number of excess deaths really came from data journalists like Rukmini looking at records that were put out by the civil registration system and looking at the mismatch between the number of deaths that should normally have occurred in a normal year based on prior records and the sudden increase that happened in the pandemic years, and saying that, look, maybe not all of them, but some of them should certainly be attributable to the pandemic. And that's basically what people try to estimate from multiple different points of view. They try to estimate the excess deaths over earlier non-pandemic years and try and account for that and say that some fraction of this should be attributed to the pandemic. But again, these are people from outside the government system piecing together data with great difficulty, putting this out only to be contradicted by government, whereas more transparency, as was mentioned just now by Madhav, would have gone a long way and would have really helped us move much faster toward the decision that we had to take.
Sure.
Again, long answer.
No, thank you, Gautam. Shubha, I think this pandemic imposed a set of constraints on all of us that Professor Anand would say brought unlike minds together. Scientists and politicians, scientists and policymakers, doctors and politicians in the same TV frame in two split windows was unheard of prior to this. So the only other instance I know where unlike minds came together was, the articles I've read about how the Clean Air Act in the US came about. It was purely driven by scientists working with the EPA data, and the entire act was supposedly written by scientists. Are we at a point in India where we can see that marriage of science with policymakers to actually write a set of, let's say rules and regulations, acts, whatever they may be, for the next pandemic, God forbid?
I certainly think that we've learned many lessons, like Shastra, for instance, is a work from home place now, which wouldn't have been possible, wouldn't have been thought of 3 years before. So we have learned a lot of lessons, particularly remote working and things like that, which had never existed before. The other area where I feel earlier journals used to be behind paywalls, and the culture of using preprints was almost exclusively the purview of the academicians. Now even journalists started assessing and reading and understanding preprints as, for what they are, with a caveat, of course, but and then the scientists started collaborating, or rather communicating. Like Gautam, I would just run to sometimes and ask him for doubts, and he would be readily explaining. Gagandeep Kang, Dr. Kang also has helped me many times in understanding papers and things like that. So that kind of that certainly makes for a freer culture of reporting, and so that's something which has come to stay, I think, because
very good.
The relationships have been forged, and they are not going to vanish in a hurry.
Very good. So I think we are about 5-10 minutes away. If the audience have any questions.
So if you look at the kind of decisions that we made in March 2020, and then let's say with vaccinations in May 2021, I think many of those decisions, I think, had enormous impact. Is there a framework for evaluating, or should we be thinking about a framework for evaluating those decisions so that if we are in similar situations in future, we have a better decision-making mechanism? So what are your thoughts on perhaps the retrospective decisions that we made and retrospective evaluation of the decisions that we made? And perhaps we could have done better, or how to handle it in future. So, anyone?
Yes.
I think it's a very good idea. In fact, people have started doing this. Of course, hindsight is 2020.
Yeah.
And that's the only thing that the writers of the paper should remember. But we should certainly do that. Couple of points I want to make in that direction. We are actually going to organize a workshop back at UVA. It's on Zoom, just like you said. Zoom has become common now, so everybody can attend this. And it's to try and bring together policymakers in the government and modelers in the same room and have a discussion about what went right and what did not go right as a qualitative way to assess this issue. We're also doing data analytics, and others are doing too, to assess this. Now, I wanted to reiterate the point I made when Professor Balakrishnan had asked me a question in the morning, that in these systems, analysis like this has to be thought through and presented by folks like you in the press, because my colleague Neil Ferguson, they worked on mad cow disease, as you know. It's been, I would say, was a successful effort. But this issue comes up over and over again. If I put the policy in place and nothing happened, do I give credit to the policy, or do I say that, you know, nothing was going to happen in the policy, why did you do that? And this causal understanding is a non-trivial thing to pull out from the data itself, because many other things happen. So I think if we can, but I do not think that that should stop us from doing it. The last part, and I'll stop, is each paper in the end or analysis is going to be somewhat close in some form. So I might do an analysis of deaths, but hard to understand the analysis from an economic impact standpoint at the same time. Governments are faced with this multi-criteria optimization. That's what makes it very hard for them. In the end, many of them probably want to do good because by doing well, they have a selfish interest of winning the next cycle of elections. So it's not like they don't want to do well, but they are torn between these two criteria and they don't know how to evaluate it very well, oftentimes. So I think we should, when we do this work, we should try and understand it from a holistic standpoint, which is a non-trivial effort to put in place.
So this was true for, you want to respond further? Yeah, I just wanted to sort of add a little bit to that. It's a great question and sort of very hard to answer at some level. I just want to point out one thing, that the National COVID Task Force, the NATAGI, etc., I don't know about all of them, but certainly the important committees, have a secrecy clause of 10 years, so that you cannot know what was discussed, what the minutes were, anything for the next 10 years. That seems, you know, under any, you can understand some level of, you don't want to second guess a decision right at the time that it's made immediately after. So there should be some reasonable amount of time. But 10 years is too long. We'd have forgotten every lesson from here by the time we get 10 years down the line. So that's something to think about. It's built into the structure of our procedures and the way government responds to these. But like you, I mean, I think we all would like to have the right reckoning to make sure that the right lessons are learned. I'm not very confident that that's going to happen for reasons just like the one that I told you about here. I would like, I mean, things that we could do, for example, is just constitute committees a little differently. And I argue about this all the time. If you look at the constitutional menu of these committees, they're very Delhi-centered, they're very male, they're very 65 plus. So it's impossible to get any, you know, variety of opinion, differences in the way people provide inputs. You know, that heterogeneity is not there. So I think at a broader level, we should also look at having committees that are constituted that are more realistically representative of the sort of diversity that we have. And only then can you have new ideas, new approaches, something interesting happening. That's a general complaint about the Indian system as a whole, not just this.
Yeah, so I can talk about my interaction with BMC and with Maharashtra government. We always spoke with IAS officers who had 200 other things to do and to worry about. I mean, it would have been nice if they had data people in the government itself. First of all, the government should have a data wing where they collect data of all sorts. It only improves their decision making. And particularly, they can also be intermediaries with us. You know, we can kind of talk to them about what data we need. They'll be less suspicious about it. They would understand that. They'll probably be able to create systems so they capture the right kind of data. So my question is, are other governments doing a better job of having data science, data analysis people within the government who are collecting data, etc., or is it all IAS officer type of people who have to kind of ultimately, do ad hoc analysis?
I can tell you a little bit about the US government because we work with them closely. So the US government does have a few data scientists, but what they have done is, at least our experience with our state was, we were not just working with the state, but we were embedded with the state. Maybe that's a much better way to say it. Which means we are working hand in glove with them as their data scientists who are brought to the service of the state. Same thing when the hubs were created on the CDC side. We were not outsiders in some ways. All the meetings were done jointly with the program managers, sometimes the decision makers, along with the data scientists. And I think that has a difference. So just to give you a sense, every week, the Secretary of Health, the Secretary of Homeland Security and Secretary of Education for our state would listen to our presentations. And we would have strong conversations because they would want to understand it. But that was very helpful because our story was being delivered at the highest levels. He understood what was happening. He never claimed to be a modeler. There are others around him who would take this input and do something with it. I'm not saying that this means everything went well, but there certainly there was embedding of data scientists within the government at the deepest level. We did the same thing at the DoD level because the Department of Defense had a lot of interest for various reasons. So I think it was done reasonably well during different points of time. But US faced, just like India, challenges about telling the country what the problem was, or overcoming the vaccine hesitancy issue, which plagues us over and over again. Yeah. The misinformation campaigns that went on in terms of effectiveness of various treatments. So the problems were faced there, and they continue in some ways. But I think this embedding was, and it worked well. To just finish this thought, certain states, when it did not work well, it is not clear how well they did. So I think as a statistical statement, and there are always cases when they didn't take models into account and they still did well, others took models into account and they still did not do well. But as a statistical statement, I can say that where this marriage was strong, that states usually did reasonably well.
We may have time for maybe one more question.
No, but I'm just saying it's a prescription to have for Indian government that maybe they need to capture data better, have people who are responsible for gathering data. It's missing right now. You suddenly meet an IAS officer who has no feel for data and all, and then everything stalls right there. Systemically, that seems like a wrong thing to have.
Yeah. And to Gautam's point, ask the question. To Gautam's point, I think this has to be, even within, there has to be a diverse group of people. I really strongly feel that single model or single small group of people making decisions about such a broad problem is not the right approach. We have seen even mathematically ensembling helps, leave alone everything else. So I feel a diversity makes this problem rich so far as they are willing to collaborate with each other well.
Sure. One last question, ma'am.
Hi, I just had a question about actionability of information. This is the thing that we are asked most often, that you're giving me this information, what is the action? And it's very hard to do that from information alone. So I think all of you have been talking about that a little bit, about a middle layer, right? And I think part of that is also like, it is a composite answer. We don't have all the components. And just knowing that a variant is there, for example, which is the information that I can provide, is not useful in itself. But if I take it forward directly to policymakers, I have to say something. So my question to you is, have you faced that? This direct, like what do I do with this information? And how can we as scientists do better going forward about this?
I can quickly answer and then I'll pass it on to panelists. I mean, when I interact, because of my interest in policy, I usually think of models as accessories to policy and think of them not as, just generating an epidemic curve or something, but saying that, look, the consequences of this is this, you should open schools at this point, this is what will happen when you open schools, this is what will happen when you do your testing, this is what will happen if you construct a vaccine trial, etc., etc. Very directly related to policy. That's just my approach. So I think there's some need here also for training. One needs to train scientists who work in these areas to also understand a little bit about policy, how policy is formulated, how it's, some of this is just experience, but part of it is also training in public policy and health policy, understanding how that's put together.
Yeah, I'll be brief, but so we approached it in two ways. In one, the CDC projection hub, the group of scientists and analysts try and think about the possible questions that might arise and build a statistical design and then try to project the outcomes of it. And sometimes those things don't occur, sometimes they occur. We also have done the reverse part where the questions have been posed by the policymakers. They wanted to know if contact tracing is working or not. They wanted to know how to distribute the vaccine. So in that case, the question was posed by them. We worked with them to refine it sometimes, but answered their question. In the other case, we made a question up effectively, if you want to call, with some anticipation of what they might face. I think both of them are needed eventually for actionable policies in a meaningful way. I'll end by just saying that we've talked a lot about forecasting and prediction, but if you look at my slides, I early on said that models go beyond predictions. Even helping us understand what's happening is a really huge success story of models.
I agree.
To gather diverse information content and make a consistent story out of it is a huge success for models. And I think that success should not be forgotten. Forecasting is, is useful, but is really not the only use of models. And I think that would be a mistake going forward, that we use it only for forecasting, in my opinion.
I think models are intended to sort of provide a unified explanation of large sets of data. At the end of the day, that's sufficient use of a model.
Just one small point is that you may be aware of the group Indian Scientists Response to COVID-19. So that was a spontaneous gathering of about 700 scientists to come together and discuss things and make sense out of data like this, right? So that was a very good thing that happened, which is another thing that we might continue in the future. So it's good to have such groups forming. Just that I wanted to say.
I think we may need to pause here. I think from my takeaways are that Zoom is here to stay, work from home is here to stay, and a marriage, sort of an arranged marriage between policymakers and scientists is here to stay. I think it's up to us to now work out the details and enrich this relationship to where these conversations continue to happen and continue to enrich our dialogue in society at large. The last point I want to sort of, we didn't get a chance to go deep into it, the idea of vaccine and vaccine penetration. All of you alluded to it in different ways, but different countries have seen differing successes with it. Could be due to access, it could be due to the mindset issues, it could be sociological and economic issues. But this has been extremely fascinating to, I think when the dust has settled, several books would be written just about, vaccine dynamics or the penetration of vaccine into societies. That's something that, and how, in a very short span of time, all the rules governing how a vaccine can be approved for public use were bent and made ready. I think the idea of bending rules will remain with us for a long period of time. I think that precedent will continue to sort of help us, I'll say, for a long period of time. Thank you all for listening. I think we need to pause here. Over to you, Shai.
So thank you everyone. We had a long day, but very enriching experience. We had a lovely, very nice set of lectures, and we listened to a lot of discussions which really helped all of us. And I hope this will enable us to start something along these lines in this field. So we now would like to present mementos to our guests today, and I request Professor Mahesh to distribute the distribute the mementos. And I'll just call out the names in an alphabetical order. So Dr. Chitra. Professor Gautam Menon.
Thank you so much for coming, Gautam.
Professor Madhav Marathe. Professor Mami Tanuchi. Professor Rajesh Sundarasan. Professor Sandeep Juneja. Professor Balakrishna, because he is the doyen of nonlinear dynamical systems. Professor Radha Balakrishnan. And finally, one special thanks to our own Professor Nilima, without whom this complex systems and dynamics would not have happened. Thank you, everyone.